All the second stage tanks now pressurized. Astronauts report it feels good. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Like a furry torpedo to the jugular. This is Honey Badger Radio. Radio with Buddy.
Equal protection under the law is great, but doesn't that mean for both sexes?
Oh my God, you hate women! Misogyny! Rape! Sexual harassment! Call the thought police!
If you haven't been hiding under a rock for the last 7 years, you should be aware of the 2011 Dear Colleague Letters Title IX guidance for post-secondary educational institutions receiving federal funding. By now, most people know that Betsy DeVos reversed that guidance because it was terrible. Those paying attention are aware that her reversal has not resulted in the widespread changes in university policy that it should have, largely due to ideological outlooks of university administrators. Some are aware that the matter is complicated by the Campus Sexual Violence Elimination Act, or Campus SAVE Act, surreptitiously slipped in as Section 304 of the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act of 2013 while everyone was debating VAWA's application on reservations. This section updated the Clery Act to codify parts of the Dear Colleague guidance into law, and some policy has not changed because universities are following that based on their own interpretations as part of their efforts at Title IX compliance. But how did we get into such a maze of conflicting guidance and enforcement? Wasn't Title IX just supposed to be about ensuring female students' ability to participate in sports? A lot of people think so, especially Gen Xers who left academia upon graduation. It's the bulk of how it was used throughout most of its existence, and pretty much all of our post-secondary education, but that was not its original purpose. The law was originally proposed as a measure to end discriminatory quotas that limited female college admissions and female participation in certain areas of study. It stipulates that no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Most of the text of the original law describes exceptions to the rule, such as for military institutions, fraternities and sororities, and religious institutions. It does not describe an exception specifically for when the sex discriminated against is male. Expansion of Title IX's original application into today's mess didn't occur all at once. Nor did it all occur through legislation. In fact, federal departments and agencies have a kind of backdoor process for expanding their reach with little or no legislative oversight. The Congressional Review Act of 1996 does require new departmental regulations and policies to be submitted to Congress. However, these become enforceable under their associated laws or as interpretations of or guidance of enforcement for said laws, not after a vote of approval, but after 60 legislative days have passed without a vote of disapproval. With no requirement for affirmative congressional consent, department regulations affecting a variety of aspects of citizens' lives, written by unelected officials with their own political biases and their own jobs to preserve, can become equal to the law, whether elected officials have considered them or not. This is how Title IX became slowly twisted via incremental changes in department policy from a means to ensure equal access to education into an attack on athletic programs and student social interactions, and from a position against discriminatory limitations to a position enforcing them. By the time Dear Colleague meandered through Congress unchallenged, by the time the Campus SAVE Act was slipped in using the 2013 Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act, Title IX was already being used against male students in a variety of ways, many due to the aforementioned policy changes and administrator biases. Over the last 30 years, Americans became accustomed to seeing not just access in general, but specific issues of student lifestyle, sensibilities, and even personal relationships and other non-academic activities included in Title IX's areas of enforcement. The law was used extensively during the 90s and early 21st century to attack the availability of men's athletic programs in women's name, where women's interest in sports was not being contravened, but was simply less than that of men. This has devastated men's wrestling, gymnastics, and track and field programs on U.S. campuses, the very programs in which our nation's future Olympic competitors hone their skills. Then along came Dear Colleague in 2011, used just as extensively to attack men's very presence on campuses, followed by the Campus Save Act, written to bolster that attack by preserving Dear Colleague's creation of a massive campus kangaroo court system. Campus Save, however, also has the capacity to be used against campuses that violate the due process rights of accused students. The Act does require that any investigation be fair, prompt, and impartial, and it states that the accuser and the accused are entitled to the same opportunities to have others present during an institutional disciplinary proceeding, including the opportunity to be accompanied to any related meeting or proceeding by an advisor of their choice. The Act says nothing about excluding lawyers and therefore does not give universities permission to deny an accused student the right to have an attorney present at his hearing. The Act does not confer upon any institution the right to subject any student to an investigation and hearing without informing the student of the process, including the details of the accusation he's facing, without recognizing an accused student's right to cross-examine his accuser, without permitting the student to present evidence in his own defense, or without considering said evidence during the judicial process. As a result, students denied these basic due process rights have filed and are winning lawsuits against the institutions that have railroaded and wrongly penalized them. University administrators and employees involved in the application of campus policy related to these issues attend an annual conference on Title IX's current status, its implications, and its on-campus applications. Over the next few shows, HBR Talk is going to look at some of the presentations that were made at this conference. Hold on to your hats, Badgers. This rabbit hole is deep. Hello and welcome to HBR Talk 45, Title IX, Protecting Women or Targeting Men. I'm your host, Hannah Wallen, here with that adorable specter of death, Prim Reaper, and our undercover reporter, Andrew, who has infiltrated academia cleverly disguised as himself to talk about his observations from the recent Title IX Research and Resources Conference at Rowan University. But before we get into today's topic, the usual reminders are in order. If you're on YouTube and it starts experiencing platform malfunction syndrome and it won't let you listen, we're also on Twitch and Facebook because you can't keep a good badger down. If you want to be sure you'll always be able to catch our live streams, even if YouTube decides to throw us in the gulag for wrongthink, and one of our channels is always in there. But if you want to catch our live show in its audio format also, remember to go to badgerfeed.com and register to receive notifications. And for the record, registration to receive notifications constitutes consent. I don't want to hear about anyone complaining that their inbox was wrongfully penetrated after you registered. And I don't want any Title IX complaints filed on that basis. They'll be referred to File 13. But back to the topic of Title IX. Let's take a look at some of what was presented to the attendees at that conference. Now, this particular presentation is titled, the title's up in our screen here, Forensic Interviewing and Conducting Trauma-Based Investigations. And so the next slide of this, it has the names of the two people responsible for this presentation. This would be Maggie Sweeney and Katie Cullen. I believe that's pronounced Vodzak. So Andrew, is there anything you can tell us about this, about these two individuals?
The first person, Maggie Sweeney, she works at a advocacy center in Philadelphia conducting trauma-informed investigations, quote-unquote. basically, so that when there's kids that have experienced some sort of trauma or something, they work with the prosecutor's office to do their investigation. That's about it. And then the second person also had worked at the prosecutor's office, Katie, but now she is one of the 2 Title IX coordinators, or deputy coordinator. Yeah, deputy Title IX coordinator at Drexel University, which is also in Philadelphia.
That's interesting. Now, these trauma-centered investigations, or trauma-informed investigations, I kind of wonder because when you look at investigations into child exploitation, those are really tough, and there's been mistakes happen with that type of investigation in the past, where investigators have tried to use special types of questioning to get more information from kids, and ended up instead they ended up creating false memories. And of course we know about the daycare panics, where there were kids with memories of things like, if I remember right, one of them remembered their allegedly satanic daycare teacher summoning demons and people flying around the room. So I mean, the memories became obviously impossible, but that didn't stop initial convictions, and it took years to get that straightened out. And there are still convictions occurring on that basis.
Oh my god.
Yeah. I'm not sure exactly how those interviews were conducted, but at least how this person describes it for their interviews when they're dealing with the children anyway. It's one person talking to the kid. They do a one and done interview, essentially, basically to minimize the amount of times the victim has to retell their story. And there's people watching that interview. It's all recorded, so we'll get more into their process, but basically they're trying to do one and done, and if the prosecutor has any questions that they need to have asked, the investigator will be fed those questions in a way, basically, so that the child only has to interact with one person.
Okay, so they're...
Like, isn't it the case of that memories of people who have been through or witnessed traumatic events is often quite malleable and subject to manipulation, intentional or otherwise? This is kind of the reason why it's important to take the accounts of all individuals involved in an investigation. Novel idea, I know.
Yeah, I got a great example of that for you. I have very, very distinct memories from 2 of my first very serious asthma and allergy incidents, both of which were near-death experiences. And for years, in my head, even though they were 2 years apart, I had combined them into one incident. And it took my mother explaining she remembered parts of the second one, and that's how she knew how old I was when the second one happened. And there were aspects of the first one that told her, you know, the things I was remembering from the first one were 2 years earlier. And so she had to explain to me that, well, this thing happened, you know, when you were 18 months old, and this thing happened when you were 4. And it was completely new information to me that they were not the same incident.
Well, I'll be darned.
Yeah. And just, I guess, to describe how the Title IX office at Drexel works, because there's basically 2 Title IX coordinators. They're both deputies. One person does the initial intake of a case. So basically that's getting the name, who they're accusing of whatever. Basically if there's any, providing resources to the complainant, that's the word. Basically, if they need some sort of accommodations, that's what happens. But that initial person doesn't actually do the investigation, at least at Drexel. There's the other deputy Title IX coordinator, essentially becomes the investigator for that case and is the neutral fact finder. So, unfortunately, a lot of schools don't have the luxury of having multiple Title IX coordinators, so they either have to just hire an outside investigator or do some other funky stuff, which has led to multiple lawsuits, unfortunately, for them.
Yeah, there's been some instances where the same person has filled both roles, and it's been very, very counterproductive. And then there's been some incidences where there's been untrained people filling one of the two roles, and that's been very, very bad too.
And then unfortunately, there's some training which is bad.
Yeah, and then there's a lot of training which is bad. But speaking of that, we should get on to the next slide. Explains what trauma-informed work includes. I'm going to have to actually move this around a little bit because I can see that it's not all going to fit properly in the way the screen is. And this text is already tiny, so we can look at the title here, and then we're going to move away from the title so we can see the rest of the text, because I'm not shrinking it down anymore. But what it lists off here, trauma-informed work includes incorporating our knowledge about the impact of trauma in all aspects of our service delivery, being empathic and encouraging with survivors, minimize, okay, so here we have, this is a grammatical error I have to point out. So we have ing, then we have no ing. Minimize re-victimization / traumatization, and facilitate the road to recovery. So what I don't see here is don't presume that don't presume guilt,
innocence.
Don't presume guilt or innocence. We immediately assume that they are a victim.
Exactly.
Yes. Unfortunately, the wording could at the conference they used the word victim and survivor a lot. Some of the presenters, the lawyers who were talking about how to avoid getting your school sued by a complainant or a respondent, actually was very good about using those terms. But yeah, the word victim was thrown around a lot in here. When they were talking, they did emphasize that this is not supposed to be a believe the victim mentality going into the trauma-informed investigation. It's just, and that they did try to emphasize that both complainants and respondents can be experiencing trauma, basically having to go through this.
Oh my god!
But it's still very screwball-y, in my opinion.
The concept of re-traumatization and things like that is a concept that we need to be very, very careful with to begin with. After all, like, okay, even just assuming that the person is an actual victim, if we treat people as though they're made of glass and we kind of like delicately step around the issue in all communication with them, it can actually make them feel more victimized and less like they're able to bounce back from their experiences. I posted a paper about this that is a relatively new manuscript, but there's a bunch of research now talking about the use of things like trigger warnings and avoiding all mention of anything that anybody might have been previously victimized by. I posted this in research, but
I believe it came out of Harvard, didn't it?
I think so.
That's what I was thinking, yeah.
I think it was titled, I have it open here, yeah, it's titled Trigger Warning, Empirical Evidence Ahead. But yeah, it's basically if you undermine a person's ability to face the things that have happened to them, you can actually make them weaker, and you can make people feel like they're less able to face their traumas in the future.
Yeah, this is something that I've been thinking about for a long time. Like the research, that doesn't surprise me, because I've noticed through another experience, and this is going back into personal experiences again. When I was 10 years old, I was in a car accident with my mother and my grandmother, and my mother almost died in the accident. We were hit so hard. We were not quite T-boned. The vehicle that hit us hit with the driver's side front corner of his four-door sedan. And these were cars that were manufactured in the 70s. This was a great big old, it was like the size and shape of a Crown Victoria, those old police cars that you would see in the Blues Brothers. So this was like getting hit by a tank. And we were hit in a Datsun hatchback. And we were hit so hard that when the cars were pulled apart, the car I had been in looked like a fortune cookie. And I talked about this accident to people repeatedly throughout my life, because this was up until my labor. This was the single most, even though I have nearly died multiple times, this was the single most traumatic experience I had had. Because I knew my mom was dying, and I knew I couldn't do anything about it. And I even had PTSD symptoms from this. I don't think I could have a full diagnosis from that, but there was a time when I couldn't talk about the accident without shaking and crying. And over time, talking to other people about the things that we learned from the accident and what my mother went through, what she's gone through ever since. She survived, but she's got severe, just immeasurable chronic pain. She has 5 different chronic pain disorders. And there are things that they're not just diagnosed because you describe your pain. There are things they measure, and they discover that you have these signs and symptoms in your body chemistry, or you have this buildup in this area between your bones and things like that, or your discs are collapsing. So we've learned a lot of things, and I've talked to people about a lot of things just over different times, and I've always had to explain the reason that her condition is so bad is because this accident exacerbated every underlying health problem she had. We were hit at about 55 miles an hour. Oof. And yeah, and the other end of it, if you guys really want a scary thing to know, you know, I always joke about, you know, near-death experiences being my hobby. Well, I was asleep in the back seat of the car with my head laying up against the door that didn't get hit.
Oh,
wow.
Yeah, so, you know, this idea that you cannot revisit a trauma and gain strength from revisiting that trauma it's not just counterintuitive, it's very damaging.
Yeah, for sure. Like exposure therapy is one of the most effective treatments for this kind of thing. That's kind of pretty well known. So, you know, trying and going out of your way to avoid all possible exposure is kind of the literal opposite of the most effective proven treatment of these conditions.
You know, and this is known for more than one disorder, too. If you have obsessive-compulsive disorders where you get stuck in a pattern of a dysfunctional behavior, one of the things that they do is have you counter that by engaging in the opposite behavior, or visiting the trigger for that behavior and not engaging in that behavior.
Exactly.
So it's important. This idea that, you know, you can't revisit the trauma and survive every time that it's bad is bullshit.
Yeah. But
you know, the rest of this I can see. You know, you can be empathetic. It makes it sound like too close to pathetic, but you can be empathetic with people when you're getting information from them. And it's not necessary to be, you don't have to sound like Joe Friday when you're interviewing somebody about their trauma. But at the same time, you know, you do want to get the facts, and you want to get all of them.
Yep.
So, yeah, when they're thinking about getting the information, their main focus shouldn't be facilitating the road to recovery. It should be thinking about how do we make sure we have the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so that we can get to the bottom of this and settle it.
Exactly.
Yep.
Moving on to the next slide, we have poly-victimization. Poor Polly. That poor girl, everything happens to her.
God.
Oh.
Yeah, so this is what I was saying right before we started, where it's all, they used all the same research, and there's one author that's common throughout it, so I didn't get a chance to read through the research beforehand, but from what I understand from the article that you shared before, it's slightly questionable.
Yeah,
Some of the aspects of polyvictimization.
Yeah, what we're seeing here, they have 2 things for polyvictimization. So the first one we're going to look at is it has this lovely circle, which has no, I'm not quite sure exactly what this graphic is supposed to be
They could have chosen a better image, yes.
More interesting than just bullet points, I guess.
Yeah, they clearly wanted it to look like, the Starship Enterprise or something. But anyway, it goes on. Evidence that victimizations tend to cluster. Okay, so I can see
That's
there might be some...
A person tends... the way that they explained it was that a person tends to be re-victimized multiple times. So that if you're a victim, then you tend to become a victim again, and by the time that the person gets to college, it could, if they're already a poly victim, it might affect how they would report something to the Title IX office or...
Right, and it says that on the slide, repeated victimization in multiple settings and at the hand of different perpetrators characterize the lives of many victims of sexual abuse and domestic violence. Now, I just want to point out one thing about this. Well, actually, I get two, but the first one is we hear all the time, that statistics on rape victimization indicate that rape is widespread in our society and that there are a lot of perpetrators. And we have research that shows that that's not entirely true, that a small percentage of the population reports being victimized, and that a small percentage of the population, if asked the right questions, will admit to having tendencies that indicate that they are willing to victimize other people. So what it really looks like is that there's a portion of the population that's very small that is predatory and violent, and it doesn't oppose getting what they want or affecting other people through violence. And then there is a small portion of the population that is less well defended within themselves against that other population. And this kind of bolsters that with this idea that repeated victimization, it characterizes the lives of a lot of victims. And it goes on to say that a person identified as a poly victim at a young age is likely to continue to have multiple types of victimization as they get older. From my personal experience, and this is not just from myself, but from other people I've talked to who were victimized as very young children, once that happens to you, and particularly if your victimization includes grooming, you develop patterns of behavior that accommodate your abuser. And those patterns of behavior don't stop when the abuse stops. And they do identify you to other potential abusers as an easy target. And it takes learning to break out of those patterns of behavior, one of which is the failure to be able to clearly communicate your boundaries, and the failure to to clearly enforce your boundaries when they're challenged. You demonstrate, instead of a fight response or a stand your ground type of response, when your boundaries are challenged, you hedge and you demonstrate a fear response, or you demonstrate a uncertainty response where you're like, am I really supposed to be enforcing this boundary? And it becomes easy to talk you into believing that for setting and enforcing your own personal boundaries, that you're the bad guy, right? Yeah. So that's a person that is, what they're talking about there is actually kind of legitimate. It doesn't necessarily mean that everybody, every person that they're going to run into is like this. And it's very, very easy to impose this on somebody who is not a poly victim.
Right, they just might have multiple bad hookups that they were at college, and then they end up getting labeled a poly victim when in actuality it was just consensual.
Exactly.
For all the cases, and they just...
And then there's another type of fake poly victim, is somebody that's been convinced that everything that happens to them or that they've been involved with that they wish they had not done means they were victimized. So
and they get into that later in this this presentation as well.
So I mean, you gotta look at the difference between somebody who maybe learned as a small child or as even an older child that setting and enforcing their boundaries is not their right, or they unlearned how to do it, things like that, and versus somebody who's basically learned that they can get out of accountability for their own actions by foisting it off on somebody else. And then you also have you can make people feel victimized if they're willing to allow you to make them feel victimized, and you can even induce trauma in a person who has not been traumatized. And I've seen that happen to people as well, where they've been through a relationship that was dysfunctional at their end of it, as much as it was at the other end of it. And they'll see the dysfunction at the other end as victimizing them, and they won't see the dysfunction at their end at all. And you can make them feel traumatized by the other side of the relationship, when in reality it was just a relationship where the two weren't compatible, or they weren't mature enough to have that relationship yet.
Or they could be equally abusive to one another.
Right, they could
Also
just both be assholes. The biggest problem is, though, that when a chick is an asshole, the law stands behind her, whereas most of the time when a guy is an asshole, the law comes after him for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's unfortunate.
So
Duluth model.
we can go into factors for poly-victimization here, in the middle of which they stuck this lovely purple, blue, and green flower
Thing.
thing. It looks like
very fancy.
yeah. So we have this poly-victimization spectrum, I guess, that I'm going to start with child maltreatment, because, to be honest, that I would say a lot of times that is the if there is somebody who's been through a series of victimizations, it most likely started with either violent abuse as a child, or violent physical abuse as a child, or sexual abuse as a child, which may or may not have felt violent. Sometimes to a child, unless there is physical force involved, sexual abuse is just very, very, very confusing, but not necessarily. The trauma doesn't make itself apparent. You don't realize what has happened to you, and you don't realize how you've been traumatized by it until the dysfunction that comes out of it starts showing up later. But it goes on.
I was just going to say, even as somebody who's like victimized just by, physical violence, you can always find ways to, like, as a child with child logic, you can find ways to be like, oh no, I'm not a real victim of abuse. Abuse victims have far worse things happening to them, even though, like, you're being slapped across the face, or you're getting bruises on your arms and things like that. It's like, oh no,
oh, these bruises were an accident. Abuse victims are bruised on purpose. Well, these bruises are nothing. Abuse victims have broken bones.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's a real shame.
Yeah, and then if you're abused in a way where you really don't know how to describe what happened to you until you're older, you also don't really know how to parse how it affected you until you're older either. And so it's, totally. It's not funny, but in a way it is, because it's like the get out of jail free card for child abusers is the fact that children are not just innocent, but because they are children, they're also ignorant. And ignorant isn't necessarily a criticism in this case, it's simply a fact.
Yeah, of course. Children just don't have the worldly experience or the level of intelligence to really comprehend what they're going through. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So
the only part of this diagram that I have issue with, and they really didn't dive into much of this. It was like a whole minute when they were talking about this. They skipped it. Is the internet violence victimization?
Yeah, I know.
I had a good laugh at that one too.
That's probably just recently added.
The
rest of them I can understand, like conventional crime, child maltreatment, peer and sibling victimization, sexual victimization, and all that stuff. But internet violence, kind of
the Anita Sarkeesian school of violence.
Honestly, the only thing that I could consider to be internet victimization, genuine internet victimization, would be if an individual sneaked into your house when you, and found a way to obtain images of you naked and then put them on the internet. But that would be in addition to other types of victimization. If they added that as a layer to other types of victimization. Internet victimization would be if somebody gets your social security number and your driver's license number and sells it online to another party that ends up using them to draw a line of credit in your name and buy a bunch of stuff. That's, you know, internet victimization, because that happened as a deal on the internet, but it's really identity theft. So this idea that it should be a second category or its own category of violence, to me, or its own category of victimization, is stupid. Because you really just need to just acknowledge that in the course of any crime, the internet can be incorporated, and that an event took place on the internet as part of that crime doesn't remove it from the context of that crime and doesn't make the crime less.
Right, yeah, the internet is the medium through which the crime occurred, instead of being something that happened necessarily in real life, like you watched somebody get shot or something like that. But it's just the medium through which the crime occurred. And when people think of internet violence and victimization, I just can't help but think of Twitter.
Yeah, of course. Something doesn't need to be classified as violence in order to still be bad. Like, you can have your identity stolen and have it be a terrible thing that happens to you, but that's not, like, being violent to you. Words have meaning, people. Yeah. Let's respect that there are different categories of things that can happen to a person that are all bad things.
Yeah, and in fact, in this case, I think the vast majority of what they would consider internet violence and victimization, which the internet violence is not a possibility, okay? You cannot be violent to somebody without... violence is a direct threat on the person, physical threat on the person. You can't physically affect another person through the internet.
Unless if you're like controlling like a robot or something.
I suppose you could conceivably affect people with seizure disorders through the internet if you manage to trick them into viewing a seizure-inducing video. That's probably the only thing I can think of that could be rationally considered internet violence, and that's because it could be damaging. But the vast majority of what they would put in that category, I think, could be lumped in with conventional crime, because if it is not a conventional crime, you're not victimized by it happening on the internet. And then
exactly,
witnessing and indirect victimization. That's another one. Indirect victimization, what the hell is that? If somebody else is a victim of something, you're not a victim of them being victimized.
Maybe if you like see somebody getting shot on the street or something, and then you're like, oh my goodness, I have PTSD from witnessing that terrible thing. And then,
I could see that, but I don't think you're a victim of it. I think it's more of a situation where, you know, collateral damage doesn't necessarily make everybody a victim.
Right.
Yeah, words are finicky.
They're substituting the word victim for victimization for trauma here.
Right, it's... Yeah.
Again, words have meaning. Let's stick to them.
Feminists suck. And I obviously we know from the experiences of people in military service that seeing something absolutely awful happen to someone that you're close to is traumatic and can cause lasting trauma that can impact your life. But
it's called PTSD.
Yeah. That's not the same thing as being the victim of a crime.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not wrong to separate those two things, because it's important that the individual who is the victim of the crime gets recourse without having to have a bunch of other people latch on and say, you know, not to be ironic, but me too.
Yeah.
You know? So, I don't know, do you guys have any thoughts on the peer and sibling victimization or school violence and threats?
I guess the peer would be something or at the collegiate level, it's your classmate or colleague victimized you in some way. Sibling, yeah, that's a thing that has happened, or older sibling can force a younger sibling to do something uncomfortable.
Yeah, I've heard plenty of stories like that. I don't really have problems with those ones.
You know, those are actual things that exist.
I can also postulate, though, or suggest that those they would fall under the categories of child maltreatment and conventional crime. And I've seen peers be abusive, too. Like, peers can be verbally and emotionally and physically abusive. Parents are responsible for that, especially the younger the peers, or younger the siblings, I mean. Siblings and peers can both do this. And pretty much anytime you're victimized by a criminal, everyone is your peer, unless they're like dramatically different from you in age, and a caregiver or position of authority over you. They're your peer. So when you get robbed on the street, you get mugged on the street, that's peer victimization, at least in my book. But sibling victimization, their sibling trauma, parents are responsible to prevent that. You teach your children. Your kids are the first, group of people that you should be teaching to get along with each other.
Yeah.
I guess we should. The next slide is results from all this studies.
It just makes me wonder, like, they separated peer victimization from school violence and threats and everything. This was not well thought out.
No.
They're just trying to add more circles to their pretty rainbow.
Yeah. So this is the results. I'm gonna scroll up so you won't be able to see that title because my hat's gonna block things otherwise. I like my hat, so...
They just wanted to use the same circle, and they just threw a bunch of random text all over it without regard for how many circles there were.
What did he ever...
Terribly laid out.
Yeah. So what we're looking at here, it says, according to the research, god damn, this text is small. That's not what the research said. That's my appraisal of it. But
are you being victimized by the text?
Yes.
Yes, I am. I need my bifocals. It's rare for a child to experience a single type of abuse. Abuse as a condition rather than event. I suppose that they're talking about kids in abusive families or abusive environments, because when I was a kid, there were plenty of opportunities for kids to be victimized by other kids. We all played outside. We all played outside largely unsupervised at a park down the street from my house. So I don't think it's necessarily rare for abuse to not manifest, or to manifest individually in a kid's life. It's just rare for kids to report it as abuse rather than I got in a fight. Let's see. Nearly 1 in 10 witnessed one family member assault another. 92% of rape victims and 76% experiencing dating violence in one sample were poly victims. That's not surprising. More than 1 in 4 witnessed a violent act. That's not surprising. Especially, well, hell, when I was a kid, I witnessed a hell of a lot of violent acts at that park. A kid who is physically assaulted is 6 times more likely to be sexually victimized and 5 times more likely to be maltreated. More than
you kind of already talked about how they can develop behaviors that make them susceptible for other people to abuse them.
Yep, and a lot of this goes along with that. The rape victims and dating violence victims. And the 1 in 10 witnessing a family member assault another, it's interesting that they didn't specify gender in this, which indicates if it was almost all reporting male family members assaulting female family members, they would have said so.
Again, no. If other presentations where it was more gender specific, at this conference, they were very specific in the genders, even if their stats were wrong.
Oh boy. Yeah, so if they'd had the opportunity, I suspect very strongly, if they'd had the opportunity to say this was mostly men, they would have said so.
Yeah, likely.
let's see. And it's more than 60% surveyed exposed to both direct and indirect violence. I'm surprised it wasn't, you know, like more than 80% or more than 90%. Most people have been exposed to some sort of violence. I suppose they weren't thinking about the television they've watched when they answered these questions.
Well, these results are of those who have been poly victims, so like 60% of the poly victims, I think.
So yeah, maybe it's like 90% of the mono victims or whatever.
Mono victims. I'm a mono victim. I had mono when I was 17, and it really sucked. I was so tired. Oh,
dodge that bullet.
Yeah.
Yeah, me too.
Well, if you ever, well, don't you know? Just cross your fingers, because norovirus has been going around this summer, and it's like it's like mono and the flu had sex and had a baby, and then the baby just reached its terrible twos. So.
Oh man.
Yikes.
Oh, yeah, I came back from Calgary with that. Let's see.
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
Jeez, lucky I didn't catch it from you.
Yeah. It was not fun. Let's see, that's actually the reason I missed the beginning of the last court day. Victimization of one type left substantial vulnerability for different types of re-victimization. See? Now, this is actually, I can agree with feminists on that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, like, they're basically just saying that like multiple times in two different ways.
Yeah. We learn bad habits from a lot of things. The one thing I disagree with feminists on is, I'm sure that they consider everyone else except for the victim responsible for protecting the victim from re-victimization. And honestly, the only person in the entire world who can change that pattern is the victim. That's a hard one for feminists to acknowledge, because they don't want... I mean, that is the feminist dictionary definition of victim blaming right there, coming from a poly victim. And I will tell you, until a person learns to stop accommodating their abusers, they will remain a poly victim.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Let's see, what else does that say? Frequent victimizations across different dimensions, different domains in the same time period. That makes sense too.
Yeah.
I mean, if you don't have the ability to tell someone to back off when they are sexually victimizing you, you don't necessarily have the ability to tell somebody to back off when they're financially victimizing you, or when they are psychologically abusing you. Co-occurrence between domestic violence and child abuse. That's not surprising either. If somebody is violent and abusive toward the people they love, they're going to be violent and abusive toward more than one of them.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Not always, but certainly often.
Yeah.
Yep.
Child who is physically assaulted. Oh, I already read that one. Children who experience, this is the last one on this. Children who experience rape or flashing, witnessing parental assault of a sibling, witnessing a murder or dating violence, average 7 or more victimizations in a given year. So they're talking about incidents there.
Yep.
And did they say anything when they were talking about that, about whether they were talking about different types of violence, like...
They just basically skipped over this slide.
Oh, that's funny. So
yeah, no, it was very...
They didn't explain any of this.
What they spent a lot of time talking about was the forensic interview process itself.
Okay. That's funny. So they didn't explain what that meant at all. Like, if somebody was repeatedly doing the same thing to the child, or if the child had a bunch of different things done to them by different people. That's not very helpful. All right, let's see. So the forensic interview structure. Sorry, for some reason, all of my muscles feel tired and weak today. Probably because I'm still recovering from norovirus. Forensic interview structure. We have 2 stages listed here. I don't know if you want to go over them, or if you want me to read them off and then you can go over them, or...
I think I can read it because I have the notes from the
Okay.
audio transcripts. So the introduction is basically explaining what's going on, explain how the interview process works, explain if it's being recorded, if it's not being recorded, if somebody's watching, basically laying the groundwork for how the interview is going to go. Building the rapport, that's basically trying to be like, oh, so what's your name? Where do you go to school? What classes do you take? Are you in any clubs? Basically trying to get the baseline for how the person responds to questions that they said specifically non-triggering, basically not bringing up the incident yet.
Right.
The guidelines is some of the settling rules. So, for example, they said before we get started, if I ask you a question and you don't know the answer to, you're allowed to tell me. If I say something wrong, I want you to correct me. I don't want to influence. And then she's the, I think it was the Title IX person that said, I don't want to influence you in any way, type thing. So,
well, that's important.
At least, yeah, just a tad. Narrative practice. So that's basically trying to get the person to be able to tell their account of something. So that would start with like, okay, so what did you do this morning? Well, if they said that I got up, ate something, and then came here, they would be like, okay, so what did you do after you got up? What did you eat for lunch? Did you do anything else in between? Basically try to get them to talk more.
Yeah.
Family, they kind of skipped over that part of it. I guess it was just supposed to be for, oh, here's your family support structure or something. I don't know. They completely skipped over that part.
So they basically didn't explain that one, huh?
Nope.
That's interesting.
Transition. So stage 2 is basically when they start to get into the nitty gritty as to why the person is there. So transition, why you're here today, trying to get to the actual topic. The narrative description, basically trying to get details of the event. If there's a gap, try and give them time to explain a gap, or if it needs the questioning leads down multiple trees of questions. So, for example, the example they used was somebody who was sexually assaulted in the back of some guy's red pickup truck, and then suddenly they were back at his apartment or something. Like, okay, try and understand, okay, so what was the car looking like? Did he smell or something? Do you know where the car was parked? Try and get as much details as possible. Follow-up questions. So, for example, in the child advocacy people, the prosecutor or somebody else would be watching. That would be the time for them to be like, okay, we need to get these specific questions answered, and then that's when those would be answered. Clarification. Basically, if there's something that there's a discrepancy, or if the person who's being interviewed needs to clarify something that they said, or they misspoke earlier, then that could be amended there, and then the closure is just ending the interview, and that's about it.
So the main focus ends up being on the narrative description and the follow-up questions then, and they're given plenty of opportunity, basically, to talk without interruption.
Pretty much how it's described. Basically, trying to ask the forensic interviewer is supposed to ask open-ended questions and basically let the person that they are interviewing talk. Try not to ask leading questions and stuff like that to try and get a particular response. They emphasize that the forensic interviewer is supposed to be just gathering the person's account of the event.
See, that's good too, because that prevents that implanting of memories, and it prevents the interviewer from leading the person to cover up details that would expose a a lie, or
Right.
you know, would sometimes a victim also will cover up details that are embarrassing to the victim, but can expose the perpetrator. And so in both
Right.
cases, you really don't want to lead the accuser's story yourself. You really want to find out what they remember.
Yeah, and then
exactly.
then they were describing how basically, for at least the Title IX type of interviews, that this type of structure should be used for both complainants and respondents.
Yep.
So that the respondent has a chance to describe the situation as well, and they're given the same benefits, I guess you could say.
Yeah, then that's really important. And I was gonna mention that because later on, they kind of phrase something as like conduct interviews geared to elicit the most truthful and accurate information from those who have either experienced a traumatic event, series of events, or adversity. And it's like, it sounds like they're really focused on getting events from one side. So that's really not what an investigation should look like. So I'm glad that they mentioned that in person.
Yeah, it's not an investigation if they don't get both sides. It's a
believe it or
shopping
not
trip, a shopping trip for a conviction. Yeah.
I don't think that there was much else that they said for this particular Title IX coordinator at Drexel. If it's a dual investigator model, if the school is lucky enough to have 2 investigators. One would be taking the notes, and the other would just be like asking the questions. And it basically said the person only has to interact with one person, but the investigator who's doing the bulk work at least has a partner. And when they need to take a break to do follow-up questions or clarification, they can consult with each other, type thing.
And
but
it looks like
a lot of schools don't record their interviews; they just rely on notes from investigators.
Okay. And it looks like a lot of these slides here are actually discussion then on, like the narrative description one here. It goes on then forensic interview techniques, and it goes into narrative invitation as the next thing it describes. Hiding the title again to avoid hiding the text under my hat. But it describes here pretty much what you had said. Let me see if I can get this to show the text, all of it there.
Basically, the interview should not be trying to describe the event or basically lead the person that they're interviewing to give certain answers. It should be all on the onus of the person being interviewed, that they need to put the words in their own mouths, type thing.
Yeah, and this is actually, you know what this makes me think of? When I had my phone call with the researchers that did the National Intimate Partner Violence and Sexual Violence survey for the CDC, and I was asking them about the reason why they defined rape to exclude being forced to penetrate. I just waited. I let them keep talking, and that is how we ended up basically learning from the way they answered that they didn't know. They didn't know why they had that as the definition. And they didn't know why that was excluded from the definition. They didn't have any logic for it whatsoever. But if I'd tried to ask more leading questions, do you have any logic behind that? Was there a particular researcher's work that came from? You know, I might have gotten, you know, some sort of excuses. They would have been able to come up with, you know, some sort of excuses that they didn't really use at the time, but thought sounded good, and I wouldn't have gotten to the bottom of things. And you can see that sometimes in interviewing an alleged victim, an accuser, who, if you let them talk, and they'll give you impossible details. And an example of that is there was a young man here in the Dayton metro area that I went to court with, who was accused of a sexual assault that involved using one hand to pin the accuser's hands over her head. Now she's taller than him. Using another hand to feel her chest up, and using another hand to whack off. Now, most individuals who know their anatomy can see the problem immediately. You know, how many hands do you have? But the victim, alleged victim, you know, nobody let her sit and give that whole narrative all at once. So this information occurred at different points in an interview with leading questions. And so none of it was put together until far later in the appeals process. And he ended up, the actual victim, the falsely accused man, ended up going through 8 years of being stuck here in Ohio when he's from another state, because he was convicted of a sex crime that he could not physically have committed. And that was a university investigation.
Yeah.
Oh,
Well, it seems like at least if the investigators weren't incompetent at their jobs, schools wouldn't be getting sued left and right for... Well, it's not just the interviewers, but the whole adjudication process, too. There's a bunch of problems along the way, but it starts with how the interview is conducted.
Yeah, and part of it is the fact that they consider the person they're interviewing a victim from the get-go, and their job, then, they think, is to obtain a conviction. And that was the case in this case. The interviewer was a security guard on campus, a rent-a-cop on campus, who was a disgraced and fired City of Dayton police officer he was fired for lying. So this was a bad situation all around. And that was part of the situation. It was he saw it as his job to obtain a conviction, not his job to get to the truth.
Find the truth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, these examples. Tell me why you're here today. Well, my parents really like each other. This one's even dumber. How come you think you're here today? Well, because I am.
Yeah.
Right. This is the whole directed at the children, but
yeah. Oh boy. Sometimes I talk to kids because someone's worried about them. That something might have happened to them. Is anyone worried about you? Start at the beginning and tell me everything about what happened is a little more direct.
Yeah, maybe.
Is anybody worried about you? Yes, I am.
I don't know.
Oh my god. See, I'm familiar with that kind of questioning because that time that I stuck my foot in hot coals and burned off all the calluses, that's basically the way the doctor acted in the emergency room. And that is a quick and easy way to piss off a child. I will tell you that right now. I got mad. I'm sitting there in the ER, and there's this big heavy thing in the room on top of everyone, and it's invisible, and I have no idea what it is, and it's very obvious all the adults do, right? And I mouthed off to him, I am a big enough girl to do things myself. No, nobody helped me put my foot in the coals. It was a mistake, okay? You know? My mom,
It's very patronizing.
yeah, my mom had to tell me to calm down and quit mouthing off to the doctor. He was only trying to help, and everybody laughed, and that was the end of that. And nobody called Child Protective Services because, you know, it was like 1979 and 1980, something like that.
People were used to kids doing stupid shit.
Yeah, people realized that children were not adults. So we're going on to their forensic interview techniques. Scaffolding and reframing, they said. So scaffolding and reframing, they have 2 or 3 things under here. Memory cues, building on the account, and repeat back to the interviewee part of what they said.
Yes, that was kind of what I was explaining before with the person in the red car, and then they ended up somehow back at the person's apartment or something. So basically trying to, okay, so you told me you were here, and now you're here. What happened in between those 2 points in time?
Yeah. Well, then that makes sense, too. I mean, if you forget to describe part of an incident, of course, the other end of it is it can bring out the fact that an incident didn't happen if they can't account for how they got from the car to the apartment.
Or if they were inebriated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They could just say, "Well, I don't remember that part."
Yeah. If there was part of this that would be concerning, it would be the reframing part. Because if something didn't happen, this would be the time for the potential interviewee to make stuff up if they were gonna make a mistake or make stuff up. Yeah.
Yeah. And then they got they go on with funneling focused narrative request, and that's where you have it lists queued open-ended questions. The
forensic interview.
Yeah, forensic interviewer picks the topic. So they might that's that. Tell me more about the car.
Right.
Or how does this person smell? That kind of thing. Then request more information about a topic mentioned. So this is still not bad. There's potential in it for screwing things up, but and instead of getting information, getting a narrative, but it still seems to be more focused towards actually getting the truth than building a narrative.
Yeah.
Or building a case, which that's the biggest problem with colleges to date has been their goal in these so-called investigations is building a case. So,
because they want to avoid basically want to avoid getting sued by the complainant saying that they didn't do anything. Right.
And now they realize that they could get sued by either the complainant or the target.
Yep.
So then the next slide is trauma-informed work, and it asks, how does the trauma-informed approach help the investigation and the victims? And it checks off these two areas: enhanced engagement with victims and prevention of trauma-related symptoms. So enhanced engagement with the victims obviously is about everything that we've just been discussing. But this other one, prevention of trauma-related symptoms. I'm curious, did they say anything about that?
Not particularly. It was a short slide.
So they really didn't explain that one, huh?
We want to avoid that re-traumatization, even though that can lead to a lot of the problems that I was talking about earlier. Sounds good.
Yeah, that's. I kind of wonder what they meant. If were they talking about avoiding the re-traumatization, or that would be interesting
that's
to find
kind of
out.
basically what it was. Just the avoiding the re-traumatization, re-victimization, like having to retell the story over and over again.
Oh boy.
Type thing.
Let's see.
But
again, they didn't talk about it when the slide came up. So.
Yeah, it's a because colleges are in hot water with providing due process rights. There's a potential problem with this approach of the one and done thing. Is the respondents have a right to confront their accuser, so schools either have to allow that to be in person or have to somehow work with the respondent to be like, hey, ask these questions, but that would end up leading to at least 2 interviews, because after the initial interview with the complainant is conducted, the respondent would be like, oh, I asked these specific things because holy crap, I'm being accused of a thing. I kind of need to be able to defend myself, but I don't know. There's they emphasize the trying to do basically everything in one shot, which if it goes to hearing, the respondent should be allowed to confront the complainant, but schools don't exactly have to do that, apparently.
Yeah, well, here's one thing. With the act that I frequently call the Campus False Accuser Support Act, the Campus Save Act, it doesn't say that they don't have the right to confront their accuser. It doesn't say anything about the accuser being protected from cross-examination. So basically, if the accused is being examined and has to answer, questions and so on, the college is supposed to. There's indication the college has to treat both sides the same. I think it would be...
that's what the VAWA 2013 with that whole thing was supposed to help address after the 2011 colleague letter kind of fucked everything up.
Right, and it indicates that there's a potential for students to base a lawsuit on that law if the university gave one student more coddling, basically, and the other student more harsh treatment. But
one of the other one of the other presentations from last year, they were basically like, if you look at what you're offering to the complainant and the respondent, it should be exactly the same in terms of offering accommodations, offering counseling services, offering an advisor to accompany them to whatever hearings or investigations or whatever.
Right. So
it should be the same.
Yeah, and that is at least a little helpful.
Right.
But let's see, and on the next slide here, it says why use trauma-informed techniques, and it gives two things. It describes episodic memory, which it defines as memory of a specific event, and script memory, which is memory of typical events. So did they expand on that at all?
Yeah. No. So basically, a script memory. Well, say somebody was assaulted or something on like a Tuesday or something. The interviewer asked the interviewee, okay, so what happened with this thing? And they would be ramble off. Usually on Tuesdays, I have class at like 10. I go for like lunch at this particular place, and the interviewer would let the person finish that out because they don't want to interrupt them. But be like, okay, so what happened on this specific Tuesday? That's the episodic memory. So that's the actual event itself. The script is kind of like your normal day-to-day. This is basically how a normal day would go for me. It's kind of how they described it.
Sometimes weird. It makes sense, though, because sometimes it helps you to remember what time a thing happened if you remember how your day normally is.
Right.
If every Tuesday you go to a particular place at a particular time, and then from that place at another particular time you head to another place, and it's the same place every time then too, and something happened in between when those two trips, you would have an idea, well, hey, I was at this place, or I was en route, or that kind of thing. Being able to remember what you normally experience and what was going on before and after the incident would help you place the time of day that it happened with. That's important too, because during the 7 Years in Hell case, the false accuser, one of the accusations that she leveled was a rape accusation, and the detective that was investigating that accusation let her go through and change the time and the date that she was alleging the incident occurred like 3 times, because the accused 3 times was able to prove where he was and what he was doing at the time of the accusation with physical proof. That he had video in one instance, he had witnesses and a receipt in another instance, and I think there was a recording in a third instance that placed him at an event where a particular thing happened. So he could not have been at the location that she said. And so we ended up, eventually the attorney for the accused essentially had to threaten the police department with prosecution with a lawsuit essentially for harassing this guy in order to get that to stop, because they were just going to let it change over and over again. Well, if they went with the combination of script memory and episodic memory in one interview, well, what you end up with there is, but you said you had just done this, and you always do this on this day. Do you also do this on the day that you just said? And, you know, was there an actual full week-long difference between the day that you thought it happened and when it happened, and things like that? It would make it much more difficult to pass a lie through these techniques.
Yeah, the one good thing about having the one, or one of the good things, I guess, about having the one-and-done interview is that basically after the interview with the Title IX person or the forensic investigator, is that account, even if there's any changes within the interview, they're noted, so that this thing is evidence now. This interview, they emphasize that at some point later, that even like your phone, your text messages, or whatever can be evidence, but also your account of event is also considered evidence.
Say the last sentence again.
That your account of the event is evidence.
Okay. For some reason it went robo on me, and I know if it went robo on me, it went robo on the stream too, so...
Oh.
Yeah.
Comcast could have been taking a dump on my end as well.
Yeah, well, with here, it can be any number of things. I'm in an apartment building, and so sometimes that screws up my internet. And then the electric box is like right outside my apartment, so that screws it up too. But yeah, it makes a big difference being able to enter those things into evidence, because it works both ways. You know, if you're able to nail down a very specific time frame, and somebody actually did commit the crime, you know, you nail it down to the moment when they are there, it makes it harder for them to get out of accountability for it, because they're not necessarily going to be able to prove they were somewhere else, even with lies, if they weren't. You know, they're not going to have any physical evidence that they were somewhere else if they were where you said they were at that time. And you may also be able to get physical evidence. Like there was an individual I know from online games that was assaulted outside of a business and defended himself, and he took a weapon away from one of his assailants. Well, when the cops were called by the business owner, when the cops got there, he had the weapon in his hand. He was arrested. But the video showed what really happened, and so he was not convicted of basically assaulting his assailants. It was discovered that he had defended himself. And with them being able to nail down the exact time, they were able to look at video from the inside of the building that showed, you know, who came in and went out the door. They could see on the other side of the door who started the fight and who initially had the weapon. And even without being able to see how the weapon ended up in his hand, they were at least able to see that he was not the original assailant, and that at the start of the fight he didn't have that weapon in his hand, so he didn't get convicted, you know. But initially they thought he attacked the group, because the whole group said, no, he attacked us, and the business owner had only seen a fight and couldn't give the police the information they needed. So yeah, that's vital, being able to do that. And let's see, going on then, we have memory is the next slide, and it explains four different types of, I don't think it's four different types of, yeah, it is, there's 4 different types of memory.
Yeah.
So did they expand on this very much?
Kind of. The recall is as it says in this slide, tell me about, basically trying to get specific details of the encounter or event or whatever. The declarative, the memory being hooked to words, they were kind of didn't explain this one too well. They use like sometimes as itself as a hooked word. It wasn't very they didn't do a good job of explaining it. Non-declarative, so that's like the emotional type of memory. They said that they try to shy away from this type of using this type of memory for, I guess, determining the facts of the case because it's feelings. But, trying to shy away from. While important for the person being interviewed, it's not a part of the forensic interview. And then the recognition memory is basically they only use it when they have to. But basically, hey, was it this person or this person? They're doing the whole photo lineup type thing. And,
like I could imagine that. The whole feel of the memories, like, you know, if you have an intimate interaction with somebody that you know, maybe you liked at the time, but then it turns out maybe you weren't so into them after all, that you're going to be looking back on that interaction and being like, oh yeah, you know, in hindsight, maybe that didn't feel as good as it did in the moment, like, and that kind of thing.
Like maybe I enjoyed it then, but then I was like, oh shit, what did I just do the next morning?
Right, exactly.
Well, and then there's also women in particular, but men do this too, have a tendency to, if they remember something but it's a vague memory, or they were intoxicated, so the memory is clouded and they're not sure if they're remembering it correctly or if it's messed up because their sense of time was messed up or things like that. They may say, and then I feel like we made our way to the car, but I don't remember how, you know, or I feel like we walked to the car, but I don't remember my feet touching the ground. I was so, you know, messed up or something. Like, they're not going to be able to use that. They'll be able to use, you know, the individual isn't certain of the time period between leaving the house and entering the car, you know, or whatever. It's wise to not rely too much on when people feel like something happened, or feel like there was an intent, or feel like a person had an attitude towards them and stuff like that. And the other one is when they say memory stored bodily. I can attest to what that is. when I believe it was a Buick. If I'm remembering right from what my mother told me, it was a Buick. When a Buick hit the Datsun, I was half asleep, and I remember feeling the motion, and I didn't have a seatbelt on because I was laying down, so I was thrown, and I put my hand up to stop myself from falling, but it didn't work. And my memory is very much attached to the physical sense of motion there, not what I saw, not what I heard. And I can't be 100% certain exactly how I ended up on the floor, or what I hit or did not hit. And like the glass from the window completely covered me. It was like a blanket. And when I got to the hospital, there was a cut on my belly from the glass. I had no idea whether that happened when I was falling, when the glass hit me, when I sat up to get out of the car, you know, none of that. So there's memories there from that like are very much a physical memory, like your muscle memory. The sense of motion can actually put me back in that moment. I've actually fallen out of bed because I occasionally sleepwalk, and there's a lot of stuff that happens at night. I have nightmares and stuff, and I have gone from, and I haven't done it now because I got a lot of stuff next to my bed, so I can't fall out now. But I've gone from being asleep and having an ordinary dream to, because of falling out of the same side of the bed that, you know, is the side of the seat that I fell off, to dreaming about the accident while I'm laying there on the floor. So it's like physical sensations can sort of trigger memories, but it's not very useful when you are trying to prove to somebody else that something happened and the details of how it happened, to have to re-experience the physical sensation that caused that memory to surface. You know, like if I would have to fall out of bed to testify to the facts of the car accident, I don't think they'd be able to question me about that in court.
Yeah, and I think another one, you said they didn't really kind of define declarative memory very much. I'm pretty sure that's basically just kind of like a. It's also, if I'm not mistaken, it's also referred to as like explicit memory, and it's basically like things that you can actively say, that you can actively remember. These are factual experiences that happen. So you could say, like, factually, just because it's fresh in my mind right now, it's like you could say, I definitely went to Taco Time for lunch, and I definitely ordered a burrito. And that is a thing that factually happened, and I can base the things that happened around that based on that explicit memory, and I can tell you that this is a thing that happened. Whereas, you know, you can talk about the feeling that you got in your body after eating a bad burrito, and it's like, oh, and then I really did not feel very good afterwards. And this is all just an example, but yeah, you can kind of get the idea between the two different types of memory.
Right. There is definitely that makes it difficult. Like, you can describe food poisoning happening based on all of the sensations, but the proof of it, if you were to want to go to court to prove that you had food poisoning, would be I went to the hospital and they discovered that I was infected with salmonella poisoning.
Yeah, exactly.
Which by the way, is also not fun.
Right. Like if you went to like a scuzzy Chinese food place for lunch, but the previous night you went to a scuzzy sushi place, and then the previous day for lunch you had some other kind of scuzzy restaurant. It's like, which of these three scuzzy restaurants gave you the food poisoning? You won't be able to explicitly say which one it was.
See, the thing is, you really need to update your restaurants. I mean, scuzzy hasn't been used in years. You should be all USB.
That's true.
So, now that I have entertained the nerds of the crowd, we will go on to the next slide, which is not the least bit scuzzy. It's all USB. Okay, so this one is another title slide. Title IX investigations in higher ed, and we're just going to...
During this time, there was some questions that were kind of being asked.
Yeah.
I can go through some of them.
Okay, yeah, let's go through some of those. We might end up making this a two-part show, and I think what we'll do is we'll go through those questions, and then we will start here. We'll go through the after the
specific
questions. We'll go through the live or not live chats, the super chats, and then we'll start here at the next show.
Sounds good to me.
So go on, Andrew. Sorry, I'm.
Somebody had asked about how the investigators, because this is specifically Title IX, these are Title IX investigators or people, about how they're supposed to pass off information when the complainant might be scatterbrained, or and how do you basically describe their body language without becoming biased. Basically, the Title IX person said, take as many notes as possible and be very specific. If you have to draw a lot on your notes, like, okay, this memory links to this memory because they told it out of order or something, be sure to just note all that. Being at the end, clarifying is extremely important, and then make sure that basically when the interview is done and you're leaving the room that your notes are how you want them to be. And then allow the person at the end to, whoever's being interviewed, to make any corrections and make any notes either at the end or afterwards, after the report is sent out. Somebody asked, do you put comments about physically seeing things? And they said absolutely. Any questions that elicit some sort of emotional response, be sure to note that. So if you ask something specific and they started crying, be sure to note that. That's why having the report phase is what they said importance, that, okay, this is how they respond to when we're not talking about the incident. So at least you can compare their demeanor in both cases. Somebody had asked, do you ever do a follow-up? They said it's not very typical. They really only have follow-up interviews if something wasn't disclosed and they find out about it later, or if there's evidence that needs to be addressed. So, for example, a text message. So what did you mean when you sent this text message type thing?
So, like, if the accused comes back with evidence that the accuser doesn't give them.
Right. Like something like say the complainant had deleted like their text messages onto their phone, and the respondent was like, "Here, I have some stuff proving something," or like,
but she said,
innocence. Right, or this is the conversation kind of leading up to the whole thing. It was kind of very different than what was described and that type of thing. And then the last question, somebody was asking about how trauma victim memories aren't all available at the same time. Basically, like, people have their memories recalled after the event at various intervals. So the way that they phrase it is that as the forensic interviewer, they're trying to get all of those memories by asking the what they said, triggering questions. It's not typical that people have to come back if they do their forensic interview correctly, because they usually get all the information that they need in the first interview, and that they typically only come back because of the new evidence. And then that's what I had described at the beginning, was some of this answer as well, was the whole, especially with the children, where they try to have it just a one and done so that they don't have to retell their story to multiple people.
Yeah, because they still think that that's traumatizing.
Right.
Or rather, that it's damaging to have that trauma.
Yeah, which is questionable, but whatever. Yeah. It's probably still good to just not have to do things over multiple interviews anyway, and try and get as much information out of one interview as possible.
Yeah, well, the other thing is, the farther away that you get from the incident, the more likely it is that memories the person comes with that they didn't have right after are not real memories.
Right.
You know, because they go away and they talk to their friends and they talk to their family and they talk to people that are very sympathetic, and it's entirely too easy for somebody to convince them that, you know, hey, are you sure he didn't do this to you, or are you sure you didn't experience this, or talk about their own experiences, and then the person comes back and thinks, well, did that happen to me? Why didn't I talk about that? And just from my own personal experience, the farther you get away from a traumatic event, you're not likely necessarily to remember things that you didn't remember before. You're more likely to alter the memories to make yourself more comfortable with dealing with them. Things not being as painful as they were and stuff like that.
Yeah, the one concern
it's called a light bulb memory. When you turn off a light bulb, there's that halo effect that lingers around the light for a few moments, and that's kind of the memory. Like, the day after it might be fresh, but as you extend further forward, that halo begins to fade, and details can become different.
Yeah, one of the things that they said is that with the young adults in a Title IX they tend to be more active in the process, because they're compared to the children, because the children might have just like said something to an adult, but not saying that, oh, I was a victim, but they just might have said some things that made an adult concerned, and that kicks off a whole thing. Typically in the Title IX world at colleges, it's the complainant going to the Title IX office and saying, this happened to me, I want to do something about this. So
yeah, although there are cases where the complainant isn't the person that the thing happened to. I've I've experienced that too. I had not with Title IX, but it wasn't directly a Title IX, but I had a friend accuse a guy that I slept with of victimizing me when it was a choice. She just didn't like the choice that I made, and it was because it was an unwise choice, and I recognized afterwards that it had been an unwise choice, but the way I handled it wasn't good. And it wasn't, I didn't feel victimized because I wasn't, but she was in women's studies, and there was a whole incident around that. So sometimes it does happen, and it's been that way for years. This was before the Violence Against Women Act was signed into law. It was when they were fighting for the Violence Against Women Act to become law. So that's how long ago it was. Because I'm middle-aged. And I was at college a long time ago. But yeah, this kind of stuff, it's possible. But even in that situation, the alleged victim is still going to be a very active participant in the investigation. You know, like my response to that was to want to go in and want to clear things up because I didn't want the guy to get in trouble because he didn't do anything wrong. But in any case, yeah, in that situation there, you know, it should be cleared up really quickly. And there have been instances in universities recently where somebody filed a complaint on behalf of a non-victim, and even though the non-victim went in and said, I was not victimized, they still, if I recall correctly, they still found the accused responsible for victimizing the non-victim. Like, they didn't even recognize her agency or her wishes.
Yeah, I remember, I think we had talked about that on the HBR News. Right?
Yeah, I believe there was a discussion on that on one of the shows.
Yeah.
But was there any more to the question?
No, not to the... Yeah, no, not to the questions. I saw somebody saying in the chat that colleges shouldn't be doing these types of investigations, and I tend to agree because while sure, all of this stuff that we've been talking about is probably reasonably good practice for somebody who's doing an interview, the colleges are not trained, or the people who are doing the interviews at the colleges are not trained in order to be good interviewers or handle these situations well compared to law enforcement.
Well, there's a really, really simple answer to this for me. All right, and that's one of the reasons, like, people keep talking about, oh, name your perpetrator in instances where people have experienced childhood abuse. You will never hear me name my perpetrator, and there is one reason why. All of the physical evidence that would demonstrate what happened for sure, and who did it, and who didn't do it, and things like that. That's all gone. You know, we're talking about stuff that happened decades ago. And my perpetrator would not have the opportunity for due process to be provided. There would be no fair trial. There would just be trial by public opinion. And I consider that to be unethical. So I will never ever name any of my perpetrators publicly because they cannot obtain due process. And they could not obtain a trial, much less a fair trial. And I don't feel entitled to smear somebody, even if they are. I know they are 100% guilty, because there is no fair process. Well, in the case of a university accusation, it's the same thing. If the university is doing the investigation, and the university is making the decision, if the personnel of the university is making a decision, that individual is not getting due process of law. They cannot be acquitted because there is not a legal trial. There is not a judge from the judicial branch of the government making that decision. So they are not having their due process rights fully recognized, even if everybody agrees that the investigation and hearing at the university are done as fairly as can be done by the university. And then the other end of it is, if the university is not encouraging these students to go to police, and somebody actually commits a rape on campus against another student, and that student only uses the university product or process to deal with it, and the crime is never addressed by police and the court system, that means there is a perpetrator of a violent sex crime that doesn't go to jail because the only process involved is the university, and there's no jail time for that. So on both ends of it, like in criminal trials, the plaintiff is not the victim. In criminal trials, the plaintiff is the state on behalf of the public. And every student walking around on that campus, going to class on that campus, sleeping in their dorm rooms on that campus, has the right. Every student that is going to parties on or off that campus and getting drunk or whatever on or off that campus has the right to know that if a violent criminal is on their campus and they are caught committing a violent crime on the campus, that law enforcement will handle it, and that the judicial system will handle it, and that the process that is in place for protecting those students against that violent criminal will take place. Because if you just kick somebody out of school, they don't have to leave town. If you kick somebody out of school, they just have to leave campus. You don't even get to tell them that they can't go to parties where other students on that campus go. A lot of parties are off campus. You know, you can't keep them from interacting with other students, and you can't keep them from interacting with the other people of the town. So this is a situation where absolutely not. This should not be how things are dealt with. If there is a criminal accusation, it should absolutely be dealt with through law enforcement and the judicial system.
Yeah, not through this extrajudicial stuff where the most that and even if person is acquitted, the complainant can appeal.
Right.
Which is just absurd that basically the respondent is found not responsible and that the complainant can still appeal that decision. I'm like,
yeah, the double jeopardy aspect of it is a whole other.
That was the case for a lawsuit not too long ago. So we'll see if in the new guidance or whenever if Congress ever addresses this issue.
Yeah, that's another one. The double jeopardy aspect of that is just absolutely egregious.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. Yeah, because and then you can be the complainant can appeal, and then maybe you'll face a criminal trial too. Who knows? But because the Title IX with these types of things are in their own world.
Well, and part of this is due to, and just to before we go on to the super chats, part of this is due to the fact when that thing I referenced in the opening video about people needing to justify their jobs. If you think about this. The Title IX, the federal office for dealing with Title IX issues, okay, there doesn't need to be, right? There doesn't need to be a whole set of employees at that office to deal with whether or not campuses are making their campuses equally accessible to male applicants and female applicants, and their areas of study equally accessible to male applicants and female applicants. They don't need to do more than find out whether the university is refusing to admit applicants or refusing to allow applicants to take certain areas of study strictly on the basis of their sex. That's all they have to do. So they don't need this huge office for the enforcement of Title IX. They don't need this huge office for investigation of discrimination issues. So they have to have some other issues that they need to address in order for their jobs, that number of people that work in the office, to continue to be justified, right? This is one of the reasons why they keep adding, well, Title IX covers this too. Oh, now Title IX covers this too. Well, we're going to apply Title IX to sports. Well, now we're going to say every incident of student conflict that potentially involves the sexes of the students, that's issue. Title IX too. You know, and the next thing you're going to find discrimination in availability of school supplies, or Kleenex, or for the quality of the boys' showers, the men's showers, versus the quality of the women's showers, you know.
Or the women aren't being given tampons. That's the thing too.
Is there a pink tax on campus? You know, blah blah blah. We'll see this never-ending string of reasons for them to continue to be employed, and at some point, it's going to have to turn around to the American people, and the folks that want to drain the swamp, actually stepping up and saying, look, we don't need a huge office to enforce Title IX anymore. In fact, Title IX is really outdated, and this issue is covered by the 14th Amendment, and we all understand this, so we can just get rid of Title IX altogether and let this issue be covered by the 14th Amendment. And if there need to be lawsuits, they can cite that. But that's something that it's going to take a lot of work from a lot of people to make it happen. So, going into the Super Chats, we have Mr. Roboto gave us US $2 and said, what is this due process you speak of?
It's a mystical thing, you see.
Well, back in the day when the United States was young and new, cared about justice, oh, God, that's the sad thing. Due process really is starting to become a thing of history. We got to fix that too. Yes,
that's for fucking sure.
And then Master Rogue gave us US $2 and said, Prim! Exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. Hug.
Hi, Rogue.
Hugging heart.
Huggy emoji, heart, smiley face. 21 Viceroy gave us US $5 and said, have you considered Spotify for podcast uploads? Castbox for Androids isn't being nice with your casts. Who knows, you might get royalties. You know, I think we actually have considered Spotify, but I will bring that up. Let's see. Tyler Preston gave us US $5. I don't think I missed one, did I? No. Okay, nope. Tyler Preston gave us US $5 and said, giant monsters are much easier to understand than women. Oh, I can't remember who it was that said, don't try to understand women. Women understand. Oh, it was Al Bundy. Al Bundy from Married with Children said, never try to understand women. Women understand women and they hate each other. Hoki Bukisa gave us $5 and said, only audio and video footage will ever fix this shit. She must be believed and your word is worthless. Phones and cars can do this for us.
Well, yeah, that's what Uber drivers have been doing, and taxi drivers have been doing, installing.
Just get a GoPro and record your entire life.
I want to go amateur.
There we go. Yeah.
First rule.
You know, nobody says you have to record in 4K.
There we go. First rule of the MRM: always be recording. And I hate to say this, but even in states where it's not legal, it's the lesser of two evils if somebody accuses you of a felony. The lesser of two evils is to have an illegal recording that proves you are not guilty of the felony. What you should not do is make that public, make that recording public, if you have not been accused of a felony. But, you know, if you are accused of the felony, you provide a copy of that recording to the law enforcement that is accusing you of the felony, not the original, and then you know, if they continue to pursue you, you supply a copy of the recording that proves you innocent to the news media. And, you know, and if they prosecute you for having the recording, it's retaliation and you can say so. But always be recording. And the other thing is, I've said this a lot, we learn as little girls, we women, as little girls, we're taught that it's our right, as much as it is our responsibility, it is our right to vet guys for character and reject guys with bad character. And in fact, if we don't do it, and we have fathers at home, they'll do it for us in increasingly embarrassing ways if we continue to make the same bad decisions over and over again. Yeah, sitting on the porch with a shotgun, you know. I had a buddy, a friend growing up. Her dad, her first date night was gun cleaning night.
Oh.
The guy had to walk through the outdoor front porch, past the father, who had all of his guns out on a table, taken apart, and he would be cleaning them. And the one he liked the best was the one who came over and was like, "Ooh, what's that? What kind is that? Where do you like to hunt?" You know, and how do you? You know, he was like all into the idea of different food preservation and all this other stuff. And he's like, "Oh, you can take care of my daughter. You know, you can protect my daughter. I like you. You're not afraid of my guns. I like you." You know, that was like they were better buddies sometimes than the date I was with my friend. But this is, you know, it's we get told there we are protected in that way. Guys should be too. You have every right, no matter what society tells you about slut shaming, no matter what society tells you about judging girls' personalities, you have every right to vet your dates, your potential dates for character, and absolutely to walk away from a girl who is not of a character that you can trust.
And certainly to hold your standards in any physical relationships. Like if she's like, "Oh, we don't need a condom," you need a condom.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and if you think you don't need a condom, statistically, half of the population has sexually transmitted diseases.
Yeah.
So just saying, you need a condom. And yes, vet women for character. A lot of people have sexually transmitted diseases, and there's more than one sexually transmitted disease that a condom will not prevent. You can get things like herpes and HPV even if you use a condom. So, you know, that character matters as well. And it's not wrong to prefer to be with someone who doesn't have a long string of 51 night stands, and who doesn't get drunk and drag some guy off at every party she goes to a back room to have sex with him. In fact, that girl's probably likely to accuse you of something that you didn't do. So, not to say that you're responsible and the woman is not if you are victimized by a false accuser. But you have every right to defend yourself, and that includes preemptive, real, genuine preemptive self-defense, which means vetting for character and judging people. Judging people is not bad. You know, judging people unfairly is bad, but it is not unfair to hedge your bets when you're dealing with, you know, is this person going to treat me badly? Is this person going to be unfair to me? Is this person going to be dishonest? If somebody is dishonest in other aspects of life, you don't have to trust that they will be honest 100% without fail about your relationship. So yeah, that's my the talk again, which I give periodically. Young men out there, and even guys my age and older, if you're still dating, you know, go ahead and you don't have to loudly slut shame somebody to everybody else in the world, but you're well within your rights to not ask somebody out, or to turn somebody down that hits on you, or to choose not to be alone with a particular girl, to be uncomfortable with a particular gal if you don't feel like you can trust her. And, you know, trust your logic. You know how you hear the dark side of the force is all about trusting your feelings? Well, trust your logic. And always be recording.
Yes, very much so.
And just trust your gut.
Yeah, there we go. Trust your gut. Do not trust your dick. It's gonna lie to you. It's absolutely gonna lie to you. So, French Honey Badger gives us US $2 and says, "I love you, Hannah." Smiley laughy face. And And rape. I've been no, just kidding.
Internet
I love you
violence.
too.
Yeah, there you go.
And I am reading that book. And French Honey Badger gives us $2 more and says, Andrew, what did you learn as a little girl? Because I said we. That doesn't necessarily mean Andrew. I'm including Andrew. I'm just saying we as in all girls. We all get that talk.
He could be called a girl if he wants to. You don't even know.
Yeah, we'll go back on that.
Oh.
And then the last one.
Yeah, let's see. Gaming Jones.
There's
Well, it's
one
not
more,
last
actually.
anymore. Gaming Jones gave us US $2 and says, when will we see Margaret McLennan on the show? I don't know the answer to that. She's not somebody that I actually have spoken to, I don't think. I'll have to look into that. But it's a consideration. How's that? Then we have Mr. Roboto gave us another US $2 and said, isn't slut-shaming a more female thing? Well, most of it is, yeah. Most women, it's a gatekeeping thing. Women do not like that other women make sex more available than they're making it. Particularly if a girl is making sex available to, say, a guy that the slut-shamer is interested in, then, you know, then she's a slut. She sleeps with a guy you want to date, she's a slut. So there's that. And women will do it more. Girls will do it more than women, and women will do it more than men. Girls will do it more than boys. But men and boys will follow along with girls that are doing it, and girls will call it slut-shaming if a guy chooses not to engage with them on a romantic level because they are easy. So, and I've also seen it called slut-shaming if a guy won't get serious with a girl. You know, if he chooses not to buy the cow because he can get the milk for free, he's considered to be slut-shaming as well. So, yeah. Guys get accused of it. And the answer I have to that basically is that when you do, because you are preemptively defending yourself against a potential false accusation by choosing not to engage with a slut, don't worry about being accused. Just let it slide off your back. You don't have to get involved with that person. Just make sure that you are able to document that you didn't get involved with that person. And so that's it. But yes, it is. As far as the gatekeeping end of it, it's definitely a female behavior. And I think that's pretty much it for the super chats. So we can end the show. We actually kept the sausage to a reasonable length, only 2 hours. So I would like to
halfway through.
Yeah, halfway through. Yeah. I would like to thank my co-hosts. I'd like to especially thank Andrew for going and sitting through this entire conference to get this information, and volunteering to come in and talk about it on the show, which is probably going to entail a few episodes. So Andrew, you get to clear your Thursdays.
Yeah, there was 3 other presentations plus a keynote.
Yeah. So this should be
One
interesting
more super
and fun.
chat popped up.
Yep.
Oh, no.
And one more super chat is, when did slut become a bad thing? Well, it's always kind of been a bad thing. In that disloyalty is a bad thing.
Yeah.
Failure to understand the relationships you're in is a bad thing.
Yeah. If being a slut carelessly could be considered a bad thing. Like I honestly, I don't really have that much of a problem if people want to sleep with a bunch of guys, or even if guys want to sleep with a bunch of women. Like it's not for me, but you know, that's really their call. But yeah, you have every right to not want to make one of those kinds of people your partner if that's not your thing. That's the way I see it.
Yeah, I'll give a brief as I can of a lowdown on my take on this. For the longest time, being a slut was like, the word wasn't necessarily used. There were a whole bunch of other words used for it, but it was completely verboten in our society, and part of the reason was because of the connotations of marriage within our society. It was a business relationship. It was a bonding between families and so on, and the only way to control reproduction was to control sex. There wasn't so much birth control available. So back then, people understood that screwing around with just anybody that you felt like screwing around with was created a risk of children born into poverty, children born out of wedlock, basically circumstances that were detrimental to the welfare of the individual and the community. And of course, after we started to understand how germs work, we also understood that it created a risk for sexually transmitted infections. And so there's two reasons why being an absolute slut is bad, right? And then we had the sexual revolution, and we were convinced by feminists and regressives that there was nothing bad about it, and we shouldn't even think about it. And we ended up with a massive increase in the number and scope of infections. Part of it is we're detecting them better and easier, but part of it is they're spreading faster because people are screwing around more. So we have learned, that it's not necessarily all it's cracked up to be. Hookup culture and free love and all of it. It's not all it's cracked up to be. And being irresponsible with your sexual interactions is just as dangerous as being irresponsible with any other adrenaline junkie behavior. Being irresponsible with rock climbing, being irresponsible with bungee jumping, being irresponsible with jumping out of airplanes, being irresponsible with surfing, skateboarding, riding dirt bikes, riding a motorcycle. If you do it irresponsibly, if you don't do it with regard to the safest way to do it and still enjoy the activity, then you are behaving in an unwise manner. And calling somebody a slut is essentially calling them a fool with respect to their sexual activity. And I don't have any problem with that. There's been times in my life when I deserved that label. And I would have had a problem with it back then because I was wrong and I didn't want to admit it. But you're not bad for being wise and being careful and mindful of your safety and the safety of the people around you with respect to your sexual behavior. And the phrase slut shaming is often used, more often than anything else, to degrade men and denigrate men for attempting to be wise and mindful with their sexuality and their sexual health and their sexual safety. And that's not right. So that's my answer to when did slut become a bad thing. Some degree of showdown gave us US $2 and said I was accused after saying I was voting for Trump. That's bizarre. I suppose it's because of the stupid pussy-grabbing comment. People don't like to admit the fact that what Trump revealed there was not that he's a sexual predator, but that there are women who are gold diggers, who will put up with behavior that they wouldn't put up with if the guy wasn't rich. And Field of Bears gave us US $2 and said, vote Giant Meteor.
Just end it all.
Yeah.
That's it. We're done. Thanks again, Andrew, for going to this horrible conference and gathering all this information. Thanks everybody for listening, and thanks for listening to me preach about being smart and so on. Basically giving the mommy talk to the general public. I'm sorry, I've been a mom for almost 20 years. You gotta recognize. And thanks for everybody who works in the background, putting together the video and thinking the things after the show is done, and everybody that makes Honey Badger Radio happen. So with that, good night all.
Good night.